bienvenidos a todos. We are very excited to host Dr. Cristina de Ramirez book talk on her book, Mestiza Rhetorics. Here it is. I'm gonna post in the chat links to our Facebook event and to the CHSS Diversity and Inclusion Committee Facebook page, because if you comment there and on our chat, there is a raffle of 2 books. We bought 2 books so that we can raffle them through the audience, among our audience today. So don't feel shy to comment, just to say thank you. That's good enough, or just to share your thoughts. Your voice is important. So we do these events because we want to hear from you. This is a service to the community. So this is us talking to you, but you talking to us too. So we want to hear from you. So that's why we'll raffle the books. That always, helps. This event is sponsored, as I said, by the Committee of Diversity and Inclusion of the College of Humanities and Social Sciences here at Sam Houston State University. And we would like to thank them for their support as the Dean's Office. They are wonderful, allowing us to connect with our community and to talk about topics that are so important to them. We're gonna ask you to keep your mics off. And if you want to keep your video on, that would be wonderful. It always supports the speaker to see the reactions, how you feel. And also you can comment anything, questions on the chat, because after brief introductory questions to get to know our author, Dr. Ramirez will give a presentation, but we'll have a few minutes for you to, talk to her and share your thoughts. So if you don't want to forget them, put them on the chat so that we can address them later. So without further ado, I'm gonna read Dr. Cristina Ramirez bios. She's an associate professor of English at the program director of the Rhetoric, Composition and Teaching of English doctoral program at the University of Arizona. Dr. Ramirez received her PhD in Rhetoric and Writing Studies at the University of Texas, El Paso in 2010. Before going back to graduate work in 2005, she taught in the public schools in El Paso for 12 years, teaching in the middle and high schools of Texas along the US-Mexico border, became a major influence in the direction of her research into Mexican and Mexican-American women writers. Her first book, Occupying Our Space, The Mestiza Rhetorics of Mexican Women Journalists and Activists, 1875-1942, at University of Arizona Press, 2015, won the Winifred Bryan Horner's National Outstanding Book Award through the Coalition of Feminist Scholars in the History of Rhetoric and Composition. Her latest work into digital archival work into family and border communities archives is titled Border Rhetorics, the Ramona Gonzalez Papers of a West Texas border barrio, Chihuahuita. She is currently research fellow for this project with the University of Houston's U.S. Hispanic Recovery Project. Now we have a few introductory questions. We have them to get us started and get to know our author. And I will start with the first question, and then I invite the audience and especially my students to follow with those questions. So the first thing we want to know is why and how did you become a researcher and a professor?
Thank you so much. Muchísimas gracias por esa introducción, Monse. Thank you very much. And I want to welcome everyone to this talk. Thank you for hosting me today. So this is a great question, and part of it was answered in the bio. I taught in the public schools in El Paso, Texas for about 12 years. And, I had been advancing in my education. I had got my Master's of Art in Teaching, and they opened up there at UTEP in the English department a doctoral degree in Rhetoric and Writing Studies. and it called my attention. And one of the things that called my attention the most was when I was in the classroom, I had always noticed that there was such a lack of women's voices in not only in the literature, but also in the history. And so when I went back to school, I wanted to become a researcher and professor, not so much on education, but on history. This history called me to become a researcher, to use my my Spanish language, to actually broaden our understanding of women in not only Mexican history, but also Mexican and Mexican American history.
Wonderful. So who wants to ask the next question? My students want to participate, I know.
Please. I love student participation.
I do too. So let us hear your voice. Who wants to go next?
Hello. Let me just first on the question.
Brian.
Why did you decide to write this book?
Well, this book is actually a follow-up from my first book that Monse mentioned, Occupying Our Space, the Mestiza Rhetorics of Mexican women journalists and activists. I had so much material left over, and I want to point out that it was edited and written with Jessica Enoch, who's also a researcher at the University of Maryland. And she had been doing research into women in Texas, writers and rhetors. And we came together and we wrote a grant to the to 4Cs, Conference on College Composition and Communication. We wrote a grant and we received $10,000 to write this book. And a lot of the funds that we used went into translation and into looking for more of these women writers. But that's really why I wrote this second book, because I had so much research, raw historical texts left over, that one book would not be enough. And then because I also got a grant to write the book, that's always a good incentive.
It is wonderful. This is wonderful. So the next question, who wants to ask the next question? Don't be shy.
I can ask it. We want to know, who were your biggest influences?
My biggest influences. Well, before I went into the PhD program, some of my biggest influences, I had been reading, and I'm glad you gave me these questions, because I pulled out some of the books that have influenced me most. Ana Castillo was a big influence of mine, and I had been reading some of her work. This is Massacre of the Dreamers, essays on chicanismo, even before I went into the PhD program. There's a poet and author out of El Paso. Her name is Pat Mora. I don't know if you've heard of her. She's wonderful. She had a big influence on Día del Libro, Celebración del Libro. And so she was one of my early influences. And then when I went into the PhD program and I started reading scholars, scholars such as Jacqueline Jones Royster. She's an African-American feminist recovery scholar, and she does work on 19th century African-American women writers. She does very much kind of the same work that I do, but here in the US and on African-American women. Jacqueline Jones Royster was a big influence of mine. A historian that I think is just, she's amazing. Mary Kay Vaughan. I don't know if you've heard of her. An amazing Latin Americanist historian, and she does a lot of recovery work on women in Mexico. She was a major influence of mine. I could, I could keep going, but I do want to mention some the importance of reading into authors across the border. Leyendo en español and looking at those influences. And one of the female authors that really influenced me was Rosa Maria Valles Ruiz. She's a scholar and historian and writer out of Durango, Mexico. Julia Tuñón was also a major influence of mine. So many of these writers from both sides of the border were some of my major influences.
How lovely to hear about all these wonderful researchers and women. This is wonderful to hear. So who wants to ask the next question?
I can.
Perfect.
What is the most interesting discovery you made while researching and writing this book?
Yeah, so there's two things. And I'm going to talk about this in my talk and also show you some pictures. But some of the early research that I did for this book was even when I was doing the research for my first book of Ocupando Nuestro Puesto, Occupying Our Space. I went down to Durango, Mexico, into the non-digitized archives that they have there. And some of the most amazing discoveries that I made in those archives, I don't think we'll ever make it into this book, but the amazing works that are still not digitized and that we don't have access to is mind-blowing. And so I think one of the important discoveries, beyond interesting, is that we need to continue going into non-digitized archives. And just because some of these archives are now all digitized, well, not all of them, but now that they are digitized, there's a propensity to maybe get a little bit lazy and only research that which is online. But we need to continue going into the archives. Another really interesting discovery that I made while researching this book was that these women were having a cross-border communication, that they were reading each other. And I talk about this in the book, and there's also a map of how these women were communicating. Women from Laredo were reading women from Mexico City. Women from Mexico City were reading women from Los Angeles. Women from El Paso were reading also women from Mexico City, from Veracruz. There were also women writing in New York. There was a piece in here from an anonymous writer called Paz that was writing from Louisiana, and she wrote to the women in Mexico City. So, just because there wasn't Twitter or Facebook, these women were making an effort to be reading each other and writing to each other and communicating to each other. So I would say that that was one of the most fascinating discoveries that I made. that both Jessica and I made while we were researching for this book.
Yes, it's so true that periodicals and letter writing were the networks of the social media of the past. That's
It
how
was.
connected and organized through periodicals and letter writing. So cool. So we have two last questions. Who want to ask the next one?
I'll go next. So we want to know, what is the most important idea you hope readers will take away from your book?
So there's several. You know, I talk about the concept of mestizaje. And my first book, it was the central point, the central grounding theory of my book. And this concept of mestizaje, of viviendo en dos mundos, ni de aquí ni de allá, that you have, that you are living in two worlds, that you are neither from here nor there. And when you live in this space, and a lot of times I know people from Texas or even Arizona, they feel this like I don't belong, or, you know, I'm very kind of different because I have this, tengo mis pies en dos mundos, and it creates a third space. It creates this third kind of space of understanding and knowing. And I argue, both Jessica and I argue in my first book, that that these women were writing from this space, and that they were creating an identity, a dual identity of being both mexicana and also americana. And what did that mean? And in Mexico, and also Cuba and South America, this concept of the mestizaje had already been being talked about, like by Jose Martí, Jose Vasconcelos. They were talking about it, but it was the men that were talking about this. And these women were enacting the mestizaje through their writings, by exchanging ideas, by actually writing about bilingualism, like Jovita Idar did. And so that's one of the things that I want a major takeaway. And number two that I'm also going to talk about in the presentation that I have is the importance of bilingualism, the importance of remembering who you are, and the importance of translation. Si hablas español en tu casa, que no te dé pena de hablar español en la calle. That if you speak at home, if you speak Spanish at home, or even another language, don't be ashamed or afraid to speak that language in the street and with other people. And don't feel that you are so different, but that you are blessed to have an understanding of two languages and two worlds, because you have an access to two worlds. And when you speak two languages, then you can go into the area of translation. Translation is big now. It came out in the mainstream when with Amanda Gorman's translation of her poem, right? Translation came right out into the mainstream, and Wall Street Journal was, you know, picked up talking about translation. So hold on to that, you know, hold on to that, and that can be your future. It was for me. So I hope that is an inspiration for you all.
Certainly it is. Certainly it is. So I'm going to ask you the last question. So after that, you can start your talk when you feel ready. But we also want to know, what are your writing practices? What advice you give students who want to research, who want to be writers? A lot of our students are first generation. They have families that they are caring for. They have jobs that are usually long hours, but they are very intellectually avid. They want to know things. They have this longing for knowledge.
Yes.
So how do you combine all that, and how do we professors can support them?
Yes. So when, I didn't start as a profesora and a researcher. I started as a public school teacher, working 7:30 to 4:30, 5 o'clock, grading papers on the weekend. But I too had this intellectual longing. And some of the things that I did was to combine my need or desire for intellectual learning, and I would bring that to the classroom, and I would share that with my students. So I was discovering along with them, and I was always looking for new writers. I was always looking for, anything new. And I would bring that also to the classroom. And I would also say to keep a journal. Write 10 to 15 minutes a day, or even 20. Just write, or even 5 minutes every day. What are your thoughts? And write those down, and you will be surprised at how over time you will fill up an entire journal. And there's actually ideas that I had written about 3-4 years in the past that I came and I said, oh my gosh, I had forgotten that I had written about this. And I pulled my exact words and I used that in some of my writings. So start small and journal and read, and get off so much of social media now. I've actually canceled my Facebook account. I don't get on. I'm trying to distance myself from some of that, because it's a time suck. We don't realize how much time we are spending on social media and TV. I got rid of my TV right before I started my PhD program, and I was able to finish it in 4.5 years, my PhD, because I just stopped watching TV. And you won't, that is a writing practice, is that you stay away from things that take your time.
I love that advice, because something that I sometimes talk with the students, and I talk to myself, it's very easy to get engaged with emotions or with, entertainment or things that people are telling you, or you're listening to social media.
Mm-hmm.
When you really feel kind of accomplished or relaxed is when you get to action, when you do things, when you create, when you think about. So it's very important to switch, right? To say, okay, let's do something about this. And that is just an intentional thing that if you keep it, like once one student, I said, just put it on the wall so that you don't forget. So when you get to action, your emotions change. That's so true.
I'm glad you say that, because that's actually something that I start with in my presentation, Montse.
Wonderful, wonderful.
You almost read my mind.
So you whenever you're ready, you can start giving us your presentation.
Okay. So let's see here. So I want to do more than just talk to you about these women. I want to talk to you about how research and writing can be an adventure in itself, seeking out new knowledge. Like I said earlier, that right when I started the PhD program, I knew that I wanted to research Mexican women journalists. And how did I know that? There was a book that I read right before I entered the PhD program by Shirlene Soto called The Emergence of the Modern Mexican Woman, her participation in the revolution, in the Mexican Revolution. I inhaled that book in one sitting. I remember I started that book at 10 o'clock in the morning and I finished like at midnight, I remember. And there was one woman in that book who like grabbed me. She grabbed my arm and said, "You're going to research me." And ever since then, I couldn't let go, and I haven't let go of her. And her name is Juana Belén Gutiérrez de Mendoza. If you have not read her in here, go and read her. She was fearless. So my second semester as a doctoral student at the University of Texas at El Paso, I got on a bus in Ciudad Juárez and I headed to Durango. And I didn't just go así without direction. It was actually an undergraduate student who had been directed to me by Dr. Samuel Brunk in the history department at UTEP. Carol, you're nodding your head as if you know who he is. I'm sorry?
I was saying that I'm from El Paso and I went to UTEP.
Okay, so you know Dr. Brunk.
I know the name.
Okay, and so I was doing my independent study with him, and he sent an undergraduate student saying that she wanted to write an essay on Mexican women journalists. And I said, send her to me. And she ended up being from Durango. She said, "Oh, I'm from Durango." And to make a very long story short, her family invited me to go to Durango with them over the Christmas break. So I find myself on a bus in Juarez on my way to Durango. Who or what did I find? So here's some of the pictures of what I did find. The non-digitized newspapers there in the Durango library. And then over here on the left, the librarians of the Juana Belén Gutiérrez de Mendoza Library in San Juan del Rio, Durango. San Juan del Rio is actually the same little pueblo where we all know who Pancho Villa is, right? That's where he was born, and that's where Juana Belén was born. But she had conducted her revolution through the pen and through the word. And so I went during Christmas time. Here I am as a graduate student at the biblioteca that I found. And these are my own words. When we read about women in a historical context, or even a literary context, doing things that we never could imagine, they inspire us. So when I first learned about Juana Belén in Shirlene Soto's book, she inspired me. But when we act on the inspiration engendered by other women, we become part of their or that historical narrative. It's like handing off the baton. It's like this continuation, this flow of narrative of events. So here we insert ourselves into the history. And here is Juana Belén. Look at her. This picture is from 1914. She's 25 years old here. And look at her stance, a very Napoleon kind of stance. And she, like I said, was from Durango, married very young. And her start into writing, first of all, she did not receive a formal education. She didn't receive any education beyond third grade. She was born into poverty, and but she had this desire to learn to read and write. Here's a good vocabulary word for you: to be an autodidactic. That means that you teach yourself how to read and write, and that was Juana Belén. Her husband was a miner in the mines of Durango, and she witnessed the brutal treatment that the mine industry enacted on the miners, and she started writing against that. And a lot of the times the miners were indigenous peoples from Mexico. And she started writing, speaking truth to power. And she was the first few times that she wrote against the mines, she was thrown into jail for the first time, I believe in like 1898. And then after that, she continued to write, speaking truth to power. She moved to Guanajuato, started her own newspaper called Vesper, Justicia, Libertad, which you can read excerpts from my book. And she was thrown into jail many times. And I'm actually going to read to you one of the pieces that she was thrown into jail for in 1903 in Mexico. And I'm actually going to get to this second question. How do her actions speak to us in this moment, over 100 years later, and why it is important that we continue to read these kinds of writings? Because they inspire us, right? And to remind us that even in the most difficult moments, that we can make a difference. Here's just a snapshot of some of the newspapers that I was working with in the microfiche. Vesper, you can find that at the University of Texas at Austin. I had to travel several times. They now have it digitized. But here is some of her writings and how they looked on a newspaper. So some of her rhetorical elements I have down here. She wrote satire, epistolaries. In other words, she wrote in the form of letters, like she wrote directly to the president. This one down here, a los mexicanos. She wrote with heavy sarcasm. Sometimes also her writings were speech writing. During the time that she was writing, there was still a lot of, a large population could not read or write. And so she wrote her pieces that they could very easily be read and understood as if they were read aloud. So she wrote to the people. Here's one of my favorite ones by Juana Belén called Ecce Homo. And Ecce Homo means, it is Latin for behold the man. And she wrote this out of Mexico City on the 15th of May in 1903. And she was writing this about the dictator at that time, who was Porfirio Díaz. And she was always behind him and very really scrutinizing his public speech, his financial actions. And here's what she writes, and she is speaking to the public in her piece here. And she writes, en la guerra un montinero, en la paz un integrante, como hombre un monstruo, como político un cobarde. He aquí a Porfirio Díaz, a Dolores, he allí a vuestro hombre. Pobre México, pobre patria mía, serás la primera nación donde se encarcelan mujeres por el delito de escribir en defensa del pueblo. The translation: in wartime, a thug; in peacetime, a schemer; as a man, a monster; as a politician, a coward. Behold, Porfirio Díaz; adulators, behold your man. Poor Mexico, poor fatherland of mine. You will be the first nation where women are jailed for the crime of writing in defense of the people. So here she was, giving a poke also to the church, because ecce homo is what Pontius Pilate said when he was presenting Jesus Christ right before they crucified him. And Juana Belén had a bone to pick, we'll say, with the Catholic Church there in Mexico. And so one of the questions that was asked earlier was, what was one of the most interesting facts that I learned in researching this book? So here I have an example of this debate, of this cross-border discussion that was happening amongst these women. So there were two women, Xochitl and Lorilei. And Xochitl wrote, she wrote this one, Las mujeres que escriben. And she, no, excuse me, it's the other way around. Xochitl wrote La mujer en el pasado, en el presente y en el porvenir. And Xochitl was very much in defense of, she doesn't write so much about suffrage of women at this time, although they knew exactly what was happening in the United States, that women had just received suffrage in 1919. And so they were trying to advance women in society in Mexico. And Xochitl, who was her, that was her pen name, was also Artemisa Sainz Royo. And she wrote this piece advancing women's ideas. And then here we have Lorilei. Whoops, excuse me. Lorilei was very interesting. Not all women wrote in defense of feminism. And so she wrote and answered Xochitl in the newspapers there and these were published in San Antonio. And Lorilei would actually write from Mexico. They would publish like in newspapers in either Guanajuato or Guadalajara, and then they would reprint them in San Antonio. And so these two had an ongoing debate about what is feminism for mujeres mexicanas. Here's a woman also that just recently has actually been receiving a lot of attention in Texas and actually all throughout the United States. The New York Times did a piece on Jovita. If you'd like to search for her really quick, Hidden No More. is the piece on Jovita Hidar. But Jovita Hidar was born in Laredo, Texas, and she came from an influential newspaper family called the Hidars, and they had established newspapers in Mexico, and they came over during the information explosion during like the late 18th century, late 19th century, excuse me, into the 20th century. And they took advantage of a growing readership in Texas. And they started La Crónica in the 1890s. And Jovita Hidar for a while was a teacher there in Laredo, but she went back to her roots with her working with her family in the newspaper of La Crónica. And so now in Texas, they had a, you know, in Texas history, they are a very important family. Jovita Hidar was one of the first writers, women writers, to acknowledge and write about the importance of bilingual education in Texas. And she was very active, not only in La Crónica, but also you can find writings that she contributed to El Eco de Golfo, the Echo of the Gulf, La Luz, La Prensa, and she founded another newspaper with her brothers called Evolución. Joanna Vaca wants to come in. I think I'll let her in. So this picture here is the same picture. It's in the archives there, UT San Antonio, which we found. And as you notice, we just took this snippet. I believe these two are her brothers. And look at Jovita Hidar's stance. We had to have this for the cover of the book. And interesting, both of the pictures that I'm showing today, the historical images, are from 1914. I'm just now noticing that. Let me see. And here are some other women. Oops. Here are some other women that were active in Texas journalism, or that were also social activists. And you can find these women in my book and what they wrote. Leonor Villegas de Magnon, she organized the La Cruz Blanca in 1913. Jovita Hidar also helped her in that formation. If you want to read more on Leonor Villegas de Magnon, there's a book called The Rebel, edited by Clara Lomas, that's very good, and it's published by the U.S. Hispanic Literary Heritage out of the University of Houston. Sara Estela Ramirez, she has the one poem in there called Surge. Andrea Villarreal Gonzalez, also a really important figure in women's journalistic movement in Texas. She founded El Obrero and also La Mujer Moderna in 1910 in San Antonio, and also Isidra Cárdenas. The dates of her are not known. I can hear an airplane going over and there's activity going on. She was the director of La Voz de la Mujer in El Paso, Texas. So here we have a coverage of overall of Texas. The importance of translation. This is a topic that I really want the students to maybe be inspired by your bilingualism and what you can do with it. So these texts were translated I worked with two translators, with Dr. Joelle Bollinger-Powell's, Joelle, she, her. She had actually done a lot of research into these Mexican women journalists and wrote what I thought was my my dissertation. I thought, oh no, she wrote my book. But Joelle actually became a colleague of mine and did the first round of all of these translations. We had probably over 45 translations done. And then we started choosing which ones we wanted to compile in this text. But in chapter 1, we talk about and define translation as a feminist act that enables us to listen to those who have been silenced and ignored by virtue of linguistic power and dominance. So our translation of our definition of translation, we work off of Claudia de Costa and also Sonia Alvarez, who are two scholars of translation. And they argue from a feminist perspective that translation has the potential to open lines of communication and enable interlocutors to engage in productive dialogue and negotiations across multiple geopolitical and theoretical borders. In rhetoric and composition, we have this term called rhetorical listening, to be able to listen to the other. And from what Montse was telling me about how you all have approached my text, which is exactly how I wanted you all to do this, is to read these women, to read the primary texts, both in English and in Spanish, and hear what they're saying and apply it to your lives today. I know I have. Translation is not easy. It's not just taking texts and dropping them into Google Translate, although Google Translate is an extremely powerful tool that we have at our fingertips. But don't be fooled that translation is that easy. There's a slippery slope of meaning that if you don't know the language, that there can be things lost in translation, but there's also things gained. And what I'm sharing here on the screen, what you see is a just an email an email exchange with Joelle. And I went back and I looked at how many emails we exchanged. I think hundreds of emails going back and forth, looking at small words. How would you say this? And looking at the transcription and then the translation. It's a lot of work, but once you get into that work, it is, it's super satisfying. So here I'm turning my my attention to the students in this class. And I think I would be amiss if I didn't talk about the time and the transition that we are in right now. This pandemic, the racial conflict that we have in our nation right now. And we are constructing new paradigms as we speak. And so what I'd like to ask of you before I open it up to hopefully conversation, I want to hear from you all. I want you to think of a moment when you acted courageously. Think of a moment and maybe jot it down or just keep it in your mind. And then another question that I have for you is, what calls you to action? Is there a figure in history who grabbed you by the arm like Juana Belén did to me and say, find me, look for me? What calls you to action? Is it your music? Is it writing? Is it speaking, playing, healing, creating? What speaks to you? And those things that speak to you are speaking to you for a reason. They're inspiring you. They're telling you to move forward and to expand your horizons with those desires. And I just want to close with this is a quote from Dr. Ramirez. In the difficult moments, in the cracks and the fissures, in the imperfections, that's where you will find your revolution. Thank you.
Wonderful. So students, yeah, wonderful. Tell us, could you respond to the questions that were posed to you? We want to hear your thoughts.
Yeah. So here we have, let's see.
They will,
Okay.
they will.
Yes, well, I see this one, Emiliano.
Okay.
By translation done to your research, do you mean y'all translated from Spanish to English? I like that, y'all. Yes, that Texas drawl. Yes, all of these texts, except one, and that was Aurora Lucero White. She was from New Mexico. This one was in English. But yes, all of these texts lo encontramos en español. And that's why we say the Spanish language press. So all of these were in Spanish. And so my researcher, my co-author, Jessica Enoch, she reads, lo puede leer, pero no lo puede hablar muy bien. And so when I would send her texts, she could read them. But of course, we could not, I don't trust myself to present a really strong academic translation. And so we had to work with translators. So yes, that's how my Spanish helped me. We were digging through all of the archives and reading newspaper clip after newspaper clip after newspaper clip, seeing if this is something that we wanted for our collection.
Tengo otra pregunta sobre eso.
Hi, Rodrigo. Is that Rodrigo speaking?
Yeah, sorry. I was actually just gonna let the person that was speaking originally. I'm sorry. I didn't know. Sorry, that's my fault.
Who was speaking? No worries.
Rodrigo.
Go next.
Thank you. It was me. Another question. ¿Encontró otros recursos que hayan sido escritos por mujeres indígenas que no están en su libro? Que lo escribieron no en español, pero en lenguajes indígenas. Porque en México había muchos indios y cosas así.
Sí había, pero es que no estaba buscando, Emiliano, y you know, and I wasn't looking. And just because solamente que no encontré, eso no es que decir que no estaban escribiendo, ¿verdad? But they are there, and actually there's a lot of this research that is actually right now being done at UNAM. And there's also a college that I'm working with in San Luis Potosí, Colegio de Colsan, el Colegio de San Luis Potosí. They do a lot of work in indigenous languages. Juana Belén, though, did claim indigenous background. So, and she understood her complicated mestiza-ness of writing in Spanish, but also claiming indigenous roots. And she writes about that.
We really enjoy Xochitl and also an anonymous from Los Angeles, I think, that were talking about all these indigenous women and their history and trying to make that history available. They themselves were recovery scholars.
Yes, they were. Mm-hmm. And
we like those a lot. So maybe Emiliano, you were inspired by that, I think, right? For that piece that we read.
Yeah, and actually, and I write in the book that whomever this anonymous writer was, I think that they took some of this history from the writings of Laurena Wright de Klein-Hans. Laurena Wright de Klein-Hans is the first writer that we include, mujer mexicana, and she compiled a text called, ay, se me está olvidando, but it's a big thick text like this about the history of women in the pre-Columbian time. And she writes like about La Señora de Tula and all of these indigenous women from pre-Columbian, Aztec, and even Mayan. And then she goes into the colonial period, and then she goes post-independence, and then to her writing about some of her contemporaries. But yes, that one is really amazing. They were recovery scholars publishing in the newspapers, right?
And making that knowledge accessible to their communities as well.
Absolutely, yes.
Rodrigo, you had a question.
Well, actually, I wanted to answer the questions that were posed. I mean, I hope that they weren't so rhetorical, but I guess one thing before I do, I guess, like, go into it, I do want to notice that it's a little bit curious that that my family on my dad's side is from San Luis Potosí, and so they actually know that I'm like 90% sure that they know where that is, like where that college is, or where that university is.
Colsan, it's a major research college there in San Luis. Yeah,
and I like, you know, like we know the area pretty well. Like, we've had family there since the 50s, 40s, you know, like it's been, yeah, my grandma has been there, and I mean everybody. So
have you visited?
No, for sure.
Have you visited, Rodrigo?
Oh, absolutely, plenty of times. I'm when I visit, I visit obviously to see family, to see my grandfather, who like passed away long before I was born. So I get a chance to kind of go see him and all that stuff. But no, yeah, for sure. But I guess to answer those questions that you posed, for me, I think my words, I think, are my call to action. Like my speaking is what always calls me to action. And I mean, I have plenty of times, I think, in my mind when I can kind of trace back when I acted courageously. But I think one of them for sure has to be like one of the first times that I was calling games here for the school. Like it's not easy to you know, get in front of a microphone and start, you know, talking about games and yeah, you know, you live with sports your entire life, but you never truly know or understand like the amount of people that will eventually end up listening to you, and, you know, even criticize up to a certain extent behind you'll never hear these people criticize you, but you have to like kind of sit back and be like, all right, I know that, you know, you have these people that will do it, but you just have to kind of ignore it and do your thing and just kind of, you know, hope that everything goes as smoothly as you possibly can.
Ignore the naysayers. You put yourself out there, and there's going to be people who criticize and critique you, and that's okay. It's part of growth and learning, but that shows that you're putting yourself out there, right? And opening yourself up to critique and criticism. And that's why sometimes people se quedan callados, you know, that they stay quiet because they are afraid of that criticism, right? But just move past that.
Yeah, and I think, and one more moment that I don't really talk about anymore, just because it was one of those. It was a moment when I spoke in front of hundreds of thousands of people at the Dallas Mega March in 2010. I was 10 years old at the time. I did a whole speech there in Dallas. And I don't really talk about this anymore just because I don't do it anymore. I was doing a lot of activism as a 10-year-old. So for me, it was kind of something that it exposed me to the world of speaking. And that's to answer that last question. What activities ignite a fire in me? It's speaking. So it was, and it's been my calling since I was 10, really. So from that point forward, I believe that's, you know, speaking in front of large crowds has been my calling.
Excellent. Are you doing things right now to further that?
Yeah, like I was saying, I've been doing the National Sports Media Association here at SAM, which basically like they go out and call games. So even though it's not in the same capacity as far as like activism, I still heavily endorse like Latino and more people of bilingual background to, you know, like join and to do things like this, because the more people that can speak both languages, the more people that we can possibly maybe even get a Spanish broadcast started here at SAM. And that's something that I feel like we've always been lacking.
Yes, that would be wonderful. And not only Spanish, but Spanglish, right? Because you are one of the speakers who are able to maintain this wonderful language, Spanglish, so you could, you know, make it more vibrant in your sports, because it's perfect. People would love to hear their own language.
For sure.
I'd love to hear from others. Some of the ladies in the class, what are some of the actions that or a moment that you have acted courageously, or what calls you to action?
Or if anyone has a question about the book or the research, that's also, anything that comes to mind is valid. Yeah. I mean, I just want to make sure that, you know, if people have a question or something, they are welcome to.
I'll go ahead and go. Well, first of all, thank you so much for this presentation and taking the time out of your day to talk to us. So I personally—
I'm sorry, who? I don't know who this is. Can you?
Oh, Natalia.
Oh, hi, Natalia.
Hi. So personally, what calls me to action is advocacy and creating basically accessible resources for communities across the board. I specifically am a criminal justice major with a minor in Spanish, looking to specifically advocate for Hispanic communities in rural and urban areas.
Oh, excellent.
I also am somewhat first generation, so I very much understand having the like ni de aquí ni de allá mindset and being a little confused growing up and being like, I do things one way, my friends do things another way, but I still see both sides. So that is personally advocacy and wanting to help people have all those resources and not being afraid to ask for help as well. So again, thank you so much for taking the time out of your day and talking to us.
It's my pleasure, Natalia. If you have not read Gloria Anzaldúa, Have you read Gloria Anzaldúa?
I have not.
We
Right.
have a little piece in otra voz, so make sure you read that. Maybe something you want to do for the final project.
Ooh, okay, thank you.
The New Mestiza. It's called Borderlands. Gloria Anzaldúa, a very important and significant writing. Oh, do we have a question here? Please ask me any questions that.
Yeah, we have a few minutes to go, so please take the chance to talk with the author and researcher. Charles, Dr. Heath.
Hi, good morning, everybody. Cristina, muchas gracias. It was really interesting to learn about your research, and I've just become aware of your work, and am very interested in your two books. I wanted to ask you a question about, I think it was Juana Belén, if that was the woman that you had an image of her standing next to like a column. She was dressed rather conservatively, almost in a masculine suit.
This one?
Yes. Remind me where she was from and let me know, was she a magonista? Was she, obviously she would have been aware of the Flores Magón movement, but whether or not she ascribed to it, I mean, in her hatred of Porfirio Diaz, I mean, it's kind of clear which that she probably was. And her life chronology kind of parallels theirs to an extent as far as exile. And so I'd like, but there's one other thing that I think is really interesting about her that I'd like if you know. So often the wife is invisible. In this case, you've made this woman visible, but her husband is completely absent. Could you tell me something about her husband if we know anything? Thank you so much.
So I'll start with the second question, and I have a lot to say about her participation with the Flores Magón brothers, the Magonistas, because she did participate with them. Her husband died when she was about 24, and she never remarried. And she had 3 children and lost a son at an early age. So it was her 2 daughters that, you know, that she took with her. So she never remarried. In some of her writings, it says that there was some, the Magonistas accused her later of being a lesbian. And being accused of being a lesbian at that time was, you know, it could be devastating, right? But in 1901 is when she started her newspaper Vesper, Justicia y Libertad in Guanajuato. And Guanajuato was a hotbed pre-revolutionary times of anti-Porfirio Diaz discourse, right? And I really detail this in my first book in chapter 4 on Juana Belén. And I ground the theory in that she uses pleito rhetoric. Causa un pleito, you know, with her writings. She was forced out of Guanajuato because they confiscated the press that she had, and she was forced to flee to Mexico City in the cover of night. And there is when she met up with the Flores Magón brothers, the Magonistas. And she actually became primer vocal of their political club. Primer vocal. You know, that means that she was key speaker of their political club, because, you know, at that time there were all these clubs políticos that were opening up, you know, clandestine in people's homes because of the fear of retribution from Porfirio Diaz. But she became primer vocal. And that was extremely significant as a woman, her being the speaker. At the time that she wrote Ecce Homo and some of these others, there's a series that she wrote in Vesper in 1903. I think one is Vesper, también viene a ocupar su puesto. When she wrote these really inflammatory pieces, the Magón brothers were in jail in Mexico City in the Belén prison. At that time, that's where they would throw journalists. It was a prison called Belén. I think she took part of her name, I don't know, from Belén. But shortly after she published those really inflammatory pieces, she was thrown into jail with the Magón brothers.
Thank you so much.
And then when they were released, I think 10 months later or something like that, the Magón brothers were released before she was, and they made their way to Laredo and then also to San Antonio, as you probably know the history. She followed and actually, I believe met them in Laredo and then went on to San Antonio, and she was writing, sending her writings to Mexico in exile from San Antonio, Texas. But she returned. The Magón brothers, as you know, never returned to Mexico. One of them, or both of them, were killed in a jail in St. Louis. And this is just my, knowing the history, the Magón brothers, they didn't go back. It's like, you go back when there's a revolution in your country and you spark that revolution with your discourse, man, you go back, right? But they didn't go back. Juana Belén went back, and she threw herself back into the fray and kept writing, and actually became one of the coronelas under Zapata. You know, the corrido de las tres coronelas, she was one of the coronelas. And then, she passed in 1942, but she became a maestra rural during the Jose Vasconcelos push to educate the indigenous communities. She went into the indigenous communities to help educate and show them civic understanding, give them a civic understanding. And
my wife was maestra rural.
Oh, sí.
Yep.
Excelente, excelente. And so was Juana Belén, and not very many people know of Juana Belén,
Now I do. Thank you so much.
Yes, get my first book. And I talk about her in there, and also this book that was just published by Trinity University Press, Revolutionary Women of Texas and Mexico. I have the lead chapter in here on Juana Belén. Dolores Huerta opens up this book. Elena Poniatowska is chapter 2 on Las Soldaderas. So this might be a book that you want to pick up too. And students, it's a good read as well. It's about Texas, grounded in Texas. Y también Mexico.
Wonderful. Some of our students need to leave because they need to go to the next class. But before we finish, I want to take a break for Dr. Shermack because I didn't invite her to talk about the next events that we're going to have with the Diversity and Inclusion Committee, and also yourself, Cristina, Dr. Ramirez, if you have new projects you want to talk about a little bit. But if any student needs to go, they can leave after the presentation of Dr. Shemak, and then we can continue any further questions if you need to. Sorry, doctor, I forgot at the beginning.
And I had muted myself. Thank you. I just want to mention, I mean, obviously we're almost to the end of the semester, but we do have 2 events still left that are coming up. One on Friday, and this is, oh my gosh, I'm gonna forget the title, but it is one of our events for Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month, and that is from 2 to 4 p.m. And then the other is coming up next Wednesday, May 5th, and that is the final event for Asian American Heritage and Pacific Islander Heritage, and that's from 11 to 1. I'm sorry, go ahead. You are muted, I think.
No, sorry about that. For this Friday, the title is Risk and Health Communication in Beyond Asia, and for the May 5th, Intercultural and Global Communication Design.
Thank you very much. That's wonderful. This was a wonderful presentation. So thank you to our speaker. And I learned a lot, and I feel like, you know, I have a lot to learn. So this is great. Thank you.
So Dr. Ramirez, do you have new projects, new events that you want to share with us?
I actually do. So if you want to hang around a little bit, I'll tell you about the research that I'm doing on my abuela, on my grandmother, Ramona Gonzalez. She was from El Paso, Texas, and this is actually the research that I'm doing under the U.S. Hispanic. Thank you, Natalia. Under the U.S. Hispanic Recovery Project. I'm recovering my grandmother. She was a writer, a Chicana writer in the 1960s and 70s, and had her work published in Chicanas en la Literatura y el Arte. Oh, here it is. If you know anything about Chicano literary history, she was published in one of the most important literary journals of the Chicano literary movement, along with Tomás Rivera, the big daddies of Chicano literature. And my grandmother was published in there. She had 5 of her pieces published. But then about 5 years ago, my mom, Sandra Gonzalez, she called me and said, you need to come over here right now. We found your abuela's papers, and we found in a vegetable box over 750 pages of manuscript ready writings of poems, fables, sayings, short stories that she had typed in the 1960s and 70s. And so in the past 4 years, I have been scanning. Thank you, Tony. I have been scanning her writings. They are now actually, let me pull that up and I can show you the work that I've done. Let me see, I'm trying to escape here. How do I get out of?
Escape several times. Sometimes Zoom gets kind of stuck. It happens to me when I share it.
Yeah.
So I use escaping.
There we go.
Okay.
There we go. And if we Google, because I've already, I have some of her writings up. It comes right up. Is my screen being shared?
No, not right now.
Okay.
And you can also share the link one in the chat.
Can you see this?
Yes. Oh, wonderful. How beautiful.
That's my grandmother. And so what I have done in the past 4 years is I have scanned all 750 pages of her writings. And she had some incredible writings. She wrote over 18 fables, 42 poems, some major short stories, one called Mi Tiendita. They owned a grocery store in El Paso in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. And she writes about the people who came in and out of the tienda that were in the barrio. I've also worked with my father, and he's translated almost all of her writings, all of her poems, her short stories. And I just heard from Arte Público, and they're going to do a children's book.
Wonderful.
They're going to do a children's book of some of her writings. And I've also heard from Trinity. I'm working with them, and so I have, hopefully, you know, I have so I have some more books in the works.
This is wonderful news. Congratulations. It will be such a wonderful, wonderful book for children to know about this abuela and her writings and how you find them. Hopefully people would look in their houses and recover their own histories.
We need to. This is where we need to imagine ourselves and our families as part of the cultural history, right? Because my grandmother's writings and her story tells like the quintessential Mexican American story of, you know, coming from Mexico or having been born in a barrio, and out of hard work and determination and education, that you become someone in your community and you contribute. And so this is my next project and my next, thank you for asking, Montse.
Beautiful project, beautiful research, beautiful presentation, inspiring. We learned a lot from you. We are very honored that you came and talked to us. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And so maybe next time I'll be able to read a picture book from Ramona Gonzalez.
That would be awesome.
A Texas Chicana literary writer that did not get her due in that time, but I'm changing that.
Right. She wasn't able to get published, but her granddaughter did.
Yeah, right?
Right.
And so here really soon, all of her writings are going to be able to be available online.
Wonderful. Wonderful.
This is part of that U.S. Hispanic Recovery Project.
If you put the link on the chat, I'll share it because I share this in my YouTube channel. So I put all those links in the video. So
Okay.
that you can check it out.
Let me put that in here.
So I'll save the chat and do that when I post video. I also will post it in the Facebook of the diversity and inclusion. So all that is there.
There we go.
Okay, so with those wonderful news, I think we are able to close this event. Thank you very much, everybody who came. If you have questions, feel free to write on the Facebook or write to the author directly. You're welcome to continue the conversation.
Please do.